who are more radical in the extrication. And those who are more radical during the time of extrication are able to argue that their opponents now in the political spectrum, post-transition, who negotiated, let the communists get away with too much. So we see a rhetoric emerging of rotten deals, unfinished, corrupt, or stolen revolutions. And this is often pushed by more right-of-center nationalist parties who try and delegitimize those who negotiated by labeling them as pinks, or as labeling them as being too friendly to the communists, etc. And these actors include things such as the Law and Justice Party in Poland, Fidesz in Hungary, and the Slovenian Democratic Party. In the commemorations in 2009, these groups emerged as powerful memory warriors. In Hungary, there was even a second memory warrior, which was Kubik, which was even more radical than Fidesz. The second pattern we see involves Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Slovakia, and Romania. These are all fractured. In these countries, there's no strong tradition of reform communism. Their communist parties were hardline, or at least controlled from Moscow until the very end of the Soviet Union, which necessitated that the final exit from communism came through collapse in all these cases. So the regime was hardline up to the end, and in 1989 or 1991, the regime finally came plummeting down because of its own inflexibility. Under such conditions, when at least one strong polarizing cleavage existed, either ideological, left-right, or sociocultural, that is ethnic, religious, or linguistic, a memory warrior emerged. So what happened is that the strong cleavage at the point of commemoration, whether ethno-linguistic or whether political, meant that commemoration became politicized. I'll just talk about a couple of examples here. So if you take the case of Romania, the commemoration came during the presidential campaign between Băsescu and Joanna. And both sides tried to somehow capture the legacy of 1989 and use it. As you know, Băsescu led a faction out of the Social Democratic Party in Romania, moved it to the right, actually started a truth commission process. That moved to politicize Romania. The existing faction of the Social Democrats, who stayed more social democratic and were supported by Joanna, or who supported Joanna for the presidency, made common cause with both the National Liberals and the Peasant Party in Romania, which were historical parties that were anti-communist. They proceeded to attack Băsescu, so it was strange. You had two factions of Social Democrats attacking the other for being compromised in the past. They formed something which they called the Alliance for Timișoara, where the Romanian Revolution began. They began to attack Băsescu, and in the middle of this, a group of veterans of the uprising in Timișoara then made a public declaration accusing them of not having the right to talk about the revolution of 1989, thus stymieing the whole strategy. But both sides were basically arguing that they represented the spirit of the revolution of 1989, and the other one had no right to say anything about it. And then the real perpetuators of it emerged and said, no, nobody does. Another good example would be Slovakia, where the ruling party was Smer, which is a left-of-center, vaguely social democratic party, led by Fico. Fico was a young communist, did not want to commemorate 1989 in an effusive way. His right-of-center opposition, which was more associated with the gentle revolution in Slovakia, did. Fico decided to leave the country and visit London and Moscow during the time of the anniversary. So the center-right began to attack him and say he was, unfit to be the prime minister of Slovakia during this commemoration. And so they also tried to make political use of the commemoration. In fact, won the election the next year, displaced Fico from prime minister, and in fact then robustly celebrated the 21st anniversary of the gentle revolution in a way that they thought it was actually fit to it. Let's move on to the non-fractured patterns. Sorry, I should have moved that along. Here we see 5 cases strongly grouped, which we would call a kind of universal abnegation. And in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, and Germany, we see depolitization and a kind of consensus, but not necessarily, or not necessarily a consensus, but a kind of agreement on the general nature of 1989 in all 3 cases. So we have this deliberate abnegation strategy, which takes place in the 5 ex-Yugoslav republics, not Slovenia. This is all parts of Yugoslavia with its unique system of reform state socialism. Here we essentially see the effects of years of war, genocide, and ethnic strife in the region manifest themselves in persistent, highly polarized ethnic, linguistic, and religious cleavages. The strength of these cleavages meant that they displaced a serious commemoration or re-examination of the events of 1989. It's also that 1989 for the Yugoslavs represents Milosevic letting go like Mussolini from the balcony at the Field of Blackbirds, not peaceful revolutions or walls coming down. So it's a little different for the Yugoslavs. So rather than reconsider that painful and potentially disputatious recent past, all political actors of consequence in these 5 countries became abnegators when it came to the anniversary. They simply did not engage on this issue because it was too dangerous and too painful to do so. So any celebrations that occurred in these 5 countries actually were sponsored either by the EU or by the German foundations. Our favorite example of this was the planned commemoration in Belgrade, where a German foundation paid a Serb artist to create a mock-up of the Berlin Wall in downtown Belgrade. And so he created this papier-mâché or plaster of Paris Berlin Wall. Unfortunately, nature intervened, and a couple of days before the planned commemoration, there was a rather powerful windstorm, and the wall was carried away, to the universal delight and irony of the Serbs. The other 3 cases were, in some sense, depoliticized because there weren't any salient issues between the main political actors at the time of commemoration. This is Bulgaria, Germany, and the Czech Republic. These were all hardline communist regimes, but there were no polarizing, salient political or ethnic cleavages at the time of commemoration, which were exploited by actors who chose a warrior strategy. In all 3 cases, there was a strong consensus about 1989 in the public sphere. In Bulgaria, this was about nostalgia. In Germany, this was displacement. That is, 1989 was neither taken up by those who would want to resurrect the legacy of the German Democratic Republic, or by nationalists because of the overwhelming power of the culture of contrition in Germany. The date coincides around the time of the foundation of the interwar republic, as well as Reichskristallnacht. It is just a minefield for the Germans, November, that time of year. And so this was kept very celebratory and a kind of general embrace of the unification of Germany rather than getting politicized. The Czech case is perhaps the most interesting in that there was a civil society mobilization and there was consensus among the politicians. So we saw actually youth, student organizations mobilizing in a kind of anti-politics fashion, acting ironically, mocking, poking fun at how the revolution had not lived up to its ideals. So for instance, a former prime minister from the ODS, Marek, made fun of the Czechs as being sheep after the Velvet Revolution. So the students went out to Václavské náměstí and put on sheep masks and marched around the square and made buying noises to make fun of the ex-prime minister and his taunting of Czech society for not being engaged, for being sheep. Another student group decided to give the politicians a present on the anniversary of the revolution, and they created a huge box, and on top of that box they also sculpted something which could be only described politely as a large pile of elementary waste. And then this was brought out to a square, and so this is our present to the politicians who have not done a good job of living up to 1989. But what was interesting about this was that the political parties agreed to commemorate 1989, celebrate it, and ignored the students. So this was kind of, yes, they can articulate their critique, we will accept their critique, but nonetheless we all agree that 1989 and the Velvet Revolution was a good thing, and so we will come together and we will celebrate it, even there will be some disputation by these student groups about whether we've lived up to its potential. Before closing, we wanted to make some observations on the idea of transcultural memory. And we were very strongly taken by Jeff's idea of regional clustering. Rather, we didn't see any globalization or universalization of memory. But we saw several examples where commemoration sort of crossed national boundaries or brought external actors into national commemoration. So, for instance, we see some cases of an extrication narrative of national literature, of national liberation by the titular elite. This is particularly strong in the former Western republics of the Soviet Union, particularly Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine. We see some countries treated as spark plugs and as seen as playing an important key role in starting the process of the end of European communism. So Poland particularly gets a big nod in this direction. We see ceremonies with topplings of dominoes in Berlin and Gdańsk, where if Jan can show the cover of the book, that's exactly what the cover of our book is Wałęsa pushing over a domino that says Poland in Berlin, and then it hits Hungary, and then it moves all the way through the Soviet Socialist republics. There was a similar commemoration in Gdańsk, as well as a large number of international luminaries there, and a lot of talk about Poland, the Polish role as kind of the initiator of the dismantling of communism. Hungary also gets brought out in this way as well. There was the picnic in Sopron 20 years later, which commemorated the cutting of the wire in the Iron Curtain between, I guess it was Gyula Horn and Alois Mach. And of course that opened the way for the GDR to come down, and once the GDR came down, the Germans occupying the West German embassy in Prague also played a big role in the events in Prague, and so you can see this kind of domino metaphor coming in. We also see where layering brought in old issues of regional importance. In the Hungarian commemoration, 1956, and 1956 is an unfinished national revolution. Emerges very strongly in 1989, and of course in 1956 you bring in the Soviet Union. In Yugoslavia, the problems of World War II and partisan warfare, and who killed whose grandfather, as opposed to who killed whose husband or son, also came into it. And of course in Germany, the culture of contrition immediately brings up World War II and the relationship of Germany to its near neighbors during the Second World War. So, some conclusions. One kind of actor is really important in all this. These actors that we call memory warriors. And in general, the mix of actors are determinant of memory regimes. But it's important to remember that actors are embedded in structures of politics and culture. So actor choices are critical, but they don't fully determine outcomes because in some sense, the actors are constrained in their choices. This is what we mean by embeddedness. Another thing that we really that we came to as a conclusion of the book, and we didn't have time to elaborate here, is that fractured memory regimes potentially have dangerous ramifications for democracy. That is, mnemonic war contributes to that one great enemy of democracy, which is a polity that polarizes. So if one looks at, for instance, if one compares, let's say, Poland and Hungary, in Hungary the memory warrior won. And we see what that did to the Hungarian polity in the last several years. It's been in some ways led to a deterioration of democracy in a country that was once seen as the leading success story in the region. In Poland, the memory warriors were defeated, and Poland was able to navigate the international global financial crisis about as well as any country in the region. And these are of course dangerous times for democracy everywhere, given the global financial crisis. The other thing we want to point out is in the face of crisis, actors can play an important role in re-equilibrating democracy. That is to say, if actors find ways to disarm warriors, to make their appeals less appealing, to take effective action against them, it can diffuse the effects of polarization. So again, we look to work of some of our friends in political science, such as Nancy Bermeo and Giovanni Capocchia. And Giovanni, for instance, picks a couple of cases in interwar Europe that look exactly like Nazi Germany, that have strong left and right extremist parties that face incredible levels of economic crisis during the Great Depression. In countries like the Czech Republic, in Finland, in Belgium, actors were able to resist what the German center couldn't by acting together and coordinating to protect democracy. So we also believe it's absolutely essential, for instance, when polarizing crises and memory wars emerge, for actors to take prophylactic action to defend democracy. If we take the best example in the region, for instance, in the interwar period, if we look at the Petka in the Czech Republic and how those 5 parties worked together to make sure the Czech democracy adhered and the system worked, and made some compromises with each other to achieve that, we can compare that, for instance, to the Weimar Coalition that wrote the Weimar Constitution, and how they were ineffective in doing that, and how they let their differences divide them, and how that made them vulnerable to anti-system actors of the far left and ultimately of the far right. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I would like to start with the second general comment which I want to make. The second being on this presentation, that the authors of an extensive book were able to put this extensive book into a 45-minute presentation. That's the second praise, and then there is the first set of praises which I would like to make. Well, I'm very much impressed how much this presentation and also the book, the whole project, has integrated the various things which social scientists do and do not always manage to integrate those things. That is, number one is the conceptual analysis, and we had the typology of memory actors and memory regimes. Number two is social theory, and we had this Piotr Sztomka-inspired four-field graph in which structure and agency and politics and culture are dealt with in a very elegant manner. So that's number two, social theory. And then empirical research and analysis. It is really impressive to have a team of researchers from various universities even though they are from the same huge country, but they still can work along the same analytical, theoretical scheme on various cases. And we had 17 cases which were further analyzed through the method of qualified comparative analysis, which is a quite elaborate method. We had a sample of the end product here in the screen presented, and it's very extensively dealt with in the book. And lastly, we had an emerging theory of the middle range at the end of this process. And those of us who come from sociology would know how important theories of the middle range are. And that's basically what we should do if there is anything normative in methodology of social sciences. That's one of the major norms. So we had a theory of the middle range of memory regimes, memory actors, and I would also say of memory wars. That probably the most valuable. And the theory, which is not only that not only helps us to describe and explain, but also allows us to predict. We have predictions in the conclusion section of Michael's part of the presentation. So that's what is so impressive about the whole thing. And it's also quite impressive that the social theory is actually guiding empirical research and middle range theorizing. Sometimes we sense in sociology that grand theories, social theory is a good thing to study in year one of your studies, but then you should forget about it. You should go into research and you should try to develop generalizations or at most middle range theories. But this piece shows that it's very useful to be guided by social theorizing, because then you can carry out very interesting empirical research and develop the theory of the middle range. Now I have two sets of comments and questions to some issues of the middle range generality, not to very specific things in the presentation and in the book which I had a chance to read too. The first is about memory, since we are in a memory conference. I was trying to think what sort of memory do we have there, and the immediate answer I had to myself was that it's the living memory, oftentimes the personal memory of the former actors of those revolutions. Because it's 20 years after, but a lot of those actors which are analyzed as actors in the political regimes, who then become mnemonic actors, many of them were actually actors of the changes. And then they make the memory of the past, which they participated in. It's not only the living memory, it's also an active memory, as it were. Coming from myself, I come from, as Barbara said, from Holocaust studies, Holocaust memory studies at present. And Holocaust, as opposed to the fall of communism, was much longer ago. And although there were very many, quite a few actors who were living at the time of the Holocaust, when Holocaust memory was constructed nationally and then was becoming cosmopolitanized, including Europeanized, then the major actors were not the ones who had the living memory of the Holocaust. And we had a presentation in the student training part of this gathering, of these few days of the gatherings, where there was a presentation about slave trade memory. Slavery memory and the memory of the slave trade. So that's even more remote. And I wonder whether we could have an analysis of this kind, of the memory regimes, an analysis which would be guided by the theory of the middle range, which this project produced, that could apply to some other memories of some other more distant pasts than the fall of communism, such as, for example, the memory of the Holocaust or the memory of the slave trade. The second set of comments and question concerns the category of regime, which is the key category here in this project. And of course it comes from political science. It's the political regime which is which was at the beginning, and then mnemonic regimes develop. But how do they develop? They almost develop by chance, as it were, because it's the memory of the fall of communism is constructed during the political struggles in the various countries, the political struggles which have the very current frame of reference. So then, does politics always play such a big role in the construction of memory as in this case, which was analyzed in the book? Being a political scientist myself, I would be very happy to say yes, but I would like to have some more evidence of politics playing such a big role as in this case. All right, that's we need to stop, and I shall pass over to the presenters, and then we shall take questions and comments from the audience.
Well, I suppose we will answer quickly, and then we'll hopefully have more questions and more criticism. Living memory versus distant, more kind of constructed. Well, I don't need to remind in this place that this is a hotly debated and an extremely complicated issue. But I think we had a very interesting take, and I take very persuasive take yesterday in Bernhard's presentation, right? And his description of his sort of professional life as a trajectory from being more sort of psychologists of more closer to the neuro part of the spectrum toward narrative, to me was extremely important to hear that story, and this is what I find the most useful position, that even someone who lived through something, they eventually relive this event through incessant narrativization. And you saw a lot of evidence in Bernhard's data of the significance of retelling. So I am not sure that the difference is that crucial between living and just knowing something from second hand and third hand and so on. There must be some difference, I suspect, but in the case of politicization, politicians, somewhat cynically you could say, narrativize with a very, if this is a good politician, with a very strong sense of their interest in mind. And so you have the participants at the round table, say in Poland, coming basically from two sides, right? All of them who participate, almost all of them, as Marek said, 20 years later, well, not all of them, but quite a few of them are still active in political life. What do you get out of two sides? 5 stories. In the chapter on Poland, we documented 5 different stories, right? But that tells you something, right? There were no 5 sides in the round table. There were no 5 different kind of things that happened there. There was one negotiation by 2 sides, and you get 5 stories out of it. In terms of the second question, middle range theory and explanation and prediction. Let me put it this way. If you have both agency and structure, so agency means that there is free will. So ex post facto we can observe what the actors did and immediately we come up with some pattern. But it also means that ahead of us, the actors still have free will. We don't know what they will do within a certain range. That is, therefore, what you have in social science, because of the existence of agency, is the basic asymmetry of explanation and prediction, which you cannot get rid of. Right? So, I would just, that would be my answer. You know, those predictions are extremely cautious. I hope you will take them as such.